Let's get started. Good morning, afternoon, good evening, everybody. I hope everyone's well and safe and healthy. I'm John Schwabish from the Urban Institute. Thanks for tuning in to this digital discussion. Very excited to have Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein with us today. They have just published a book, although I want to say it came out like a month or two, maybe.
Yeah, March 10th, basically.
March 10th, yeah. Yeah, so like a month ago, so this is great. And as always, throw your questions in the chat window. I'll try to build up a little queue. For those who were here yesterday, we had a really nice conversation where towards the end of the hour, people were just able to unmute themselves, and it was sort of organized chaos, seemed to work out pretty well. So we'll see if we could do that again if we need to. So if you have questions, just throw them in the chat window and I'll build up a little queue for Catherine and Lauren. And I'll just start by asking you two to maybe just introduce yourselves, background, where you are, and then yeah, maybe just talk about the book and we'll just go from there. So yeah, Catherine and Lauren, it's over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Thanks, John, for having us on, and thanks to the people who showed up. We really appreciate having a chance to talk with you. Primarily because, yeah, about a month ago, we were set to release this physical thing into the world, and then literally the day before our launch party at the MIT Press bookstore, you know, they canceled the event. That was the week that everything got canceled. We carefully lined up this sort of book tour. The emails came in, everything's canceled. So, I mean, one of the sort of upsides of all the cancellations is that people have been reorganizing and doing all these virtual events. So it's great to be able to kind of keep launching the book with new people and new virtual situations that we never had planned for. So yeah, so I'm Catherine D'Ignazio. I'm a newly, as of just January, I'm a assistant professor of urban science and planning at MIT in a department of urban planning. And yeah, broadly speaking, my background is in software programming and art and design. And one of the things I'm really excited about building off of the work of this book is that I've just started up a lab called the Data Plus Feminism Lab at MIT. So we're starting to kind of look at like, how do we not only sort of build out from these design principles, but how do we also sort of enact those in really like applied project areas? So yeah, Lauren, go for it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Klein. I am an associate professor at Emory University. I am actually split between two departments, a department called Quantitative Theory and Methods, which is essentially sort of fancy data science, and English, which is part of my background. Sort of like Catherine, I have a background in software development. I worked as a software developer before I went to grad school, but then I went to grad school in English, and that's what my degree is in. And my primary area is a field called digital humanities. And it's all about how you can use digital, and in my case, computational technologies more specifically, in order to ask both old and new humanistic questions. So I have sort of research expertise in the 18th century. I have a book actually about food in the 18th century and why it matters for thinking about issues of race and American citizenship and things like this. I'm also working on a project about the history of data visualization. So looking at its developments in the 18th century, but all trying to do this through both web methods, like making web sort of born digital publications, and then also using data science techniques to ask questions at large scale over text that's been turned into data. I also have a lab, the Digital Humanities Lab, that is sort of where I work with my students on some larger multi-person projects. And yeah, that's, oh, and I'm based in Atlanta. Did I say that? Right, so I teach at Emory. Like Catherine, I also switched jobs this past year. I used to work at Georgia Tech for a pretty long time, for 8 years, but now I'm at Emory. And yeah, so that's a little bit about me. Catherine, do you think, should we just sort of go into it, talk a little bit about the book?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe I will, I'll start, and then Catherine, if you sort of want to take over or jump in. So, we wrote the book because of sort of a fact that has sort of become a truism almost, that data is power, right? We see this, we both sort of see this and live this. And I think now in the time of coronavirus, we're seeing this, society writ large is seeing this, every day in many different contexts. Just the idea that data can be marshaled by individuals, by corporations, by people in power in order to make arguments and convince people of things, right? And the people who have the ability to do this have tended historically to be people in power. And then the end result is that because the people in power are the ones who have access to all of this data and sort of ways to make decisions based on it, the decisions that are made tend to reflect the perspectives of those in power, right? And the people who have this sort of, who are acted upon by data or have their data taken or sort of don't have a say in all of this sort of data-driven decision-making really get left out of the equation to a range of effects. The most minor effect, you just sort of don't see your perspective represented or your voice heard. But in the most significant consequences, it can lead to actual impact, on a case of life or death, right? And so we can see this, all over the place. And Catherine can I'm sure sort of provide some examples after this. But I guess the question is like, well, what do we do about it, right? Data's here, it's everywhere, it's impacting our lives. And one thing we can do is to sort of throw up our hands and say, I refuse all data. It's a terrible thing and it comes from a bad place and will only lead to bad things. And then another approach is to say, okay, we can hear that history, we could acknowledge that history, but if we have the skills or want to have the skills in order to do better, to sort of do better work with data, to use it for transformative good instead of just reinforcing all of these old power inequalities, how do we actually do that? What are some models that we can learn from or use to structure our work so that we can do a better job of this, so that we are not participating in the same cycle of just widening inequality, not just in everyday life, but also in data and data practices. So maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, and maybe I'll say a little bit of how we came together. So one of the things we first started working on was visualization, actually. So like I was teaching data visualization and Lauren was writing about data visualization. And we were both independently talking about the idea of, what would it look like to have a feminist approach to data visualization. And so we wrote a short paper about that. And then one of the things we realized in writing that short paper was like, a visualization is sort of an output, like it's the end product of like this whole process that comes before. And so in a way, like if the data has been collected in an oppressive way, or if the categories are reinforcing sort of harmful things like the gender binary or sort of very stereotypical or derogatory conceptions of race, or if the data has been analyzed in a harmful way or cleaned in a strange way, like you can't like go back in the data visualization process and fix all those things. So we have to think about like the whole process. And so that's kind of where the motivation for the book came. And then, yeah, just as Lauren's saying, it's really in so many ways, the book is about power and how data is power, and also how we have a responsibility, those of us who aspire to sort of do responsible use of data science and artificial intelligence and visualization, to really sensitize ourselves to how power, meaning structural oppression, shows up in data sets, how it shows up in data products, and to take really intentional steps to try to mitigate those inequalities. Because the reality over and over again, and we cite a lot of work in this regard, but it's just that without that kind of careful, intentional focus, the easiest thing to do is reproduce the status quo. And from a feminist perspective, feminism is about equal rights for women and non-binary people. And it's also about taking what Kimberly Crenshaw or the Combahee River Collective would call an intersectional perspective. So it's not only about kind of unequal gender power. So we are talking about sexism and patriarchy, but we're also talking about its intersection with things like racism and classism, with things like colonialism. And so thinking about how do we tune in to how those forces show up in our data sets so that we don't keep producing racist and sexist data products. And so like you can see, I feel like almost every week there's some new scandal or something and everyone's throwing up their hands and like, oh my goodness, like, you know, self-driving cars, like it turns out they, you know, can't see people of color as well as they can see white people or something. And so I don't think it's helpful to have this like continuous shock of like, algorithms are biased, because it's not that the algorithms are biased, right? It's just the people are the biased people. And so we need to have kind of we need to take a step back and to do a little bit more of an analysis of power in the environment so that we're not always like, oh my God, how did this happen, right? So yeah, that's, I guess that's the motivation and sort of the fundamental premise of the book.
That's great. I wonder if maybe, because the one thing that I really like about the book is all the examples and the stories and the vignettes. And I wonder if maybe you could tell one or two, maybe just as a concrete way for people to get their head around the premise of the book.
Sure.
Yeah.
You know, so I feel like I should back up and say just one more thing is that, you know, there's lots of theories about how power works in the world, right? And not all of them are feminist theories of power. But the reason why, you know, our starting point and our sort of attraction, like, you know, why we thought feminism was a really good way to sort of crack open this problem is that feminist theories of power really have to do with these questions of unequal power relations. And more than that, attaching them to sort of different layers of how they both sort of begin and are perpetuated in the world today. So you could have sort of like an abstract theory of power. You know, I think, you know, like if anyone has taken, and I don't even know if this is like too nerdy or whatever, but like Louis Althusser or something has that little triangle where there's like, you know, the little tippy top is like, you know, power that you can see and everything else is like, you know, power that is perpetuated, you know, inadvertently or just sort of secretly and silently. But feminist theories of power offer a little bit more of a concrete way of identifying sort of how these invisible forces of power operate. And I'm getting to the example here because I think it's really helpful. So one of the main feminist theories of power that we take, which is one that Catherine alluded to in the book, is Patricia Hill Collins's idea of the matrix of domination. And what Patricia Hill Collins does is identify 4 specific ways in which sort of unequal power operates in the world. And one is this like top level, the government makes a law that says, you know, let's see, like Black people can't vote, right? You know, so that's a way in which the government like perpetuates inequality. But then there are several levels below that, which are also helpful to recognize that you can, so it sort of helps you see both how the unequal power is happening and then how you can fix it. So Patricia Hill Collins gives the example of the sort of right below the level of the like explicit governmental control, the idea of there's sort of a domain in which it's not direct laws that could sort of make the power imbalances happen, but they're sort of indirect. Like you could see like voter ID laws, which make it sort of harder to vote, or restricting the times of the polling places so that it's harder to vote. And these again sort of have these reverberating effects. So they impact the same people without explicitly saying you can't vote. Then there's also like another level, which is like the domain of sort of culture. She calls this a hegemonic domain, but it's like, you know, cultural and social attitudes like racism or sexism, right? Which also impact these power imbalances, impacting the way that people make decisions, both personally, but also affected by culture. And then the personal domain, which is like how power impacts you. And on the one hand, like, you know, if you're a person standing online waiting to vote and it's it's been 5 hours and you have a kid at home, or you're missing your hourly wage job, you know, eventually you might just give up, right? Because you feel power impacting you. So there's all these different levels. And once you have these models, you can sort of see how, again, it's not just a personal thing, or at the top, it's not just a government thing, but it's all the way through all sorts of levels of society. And so to give this a little bit more of a concrete anchor, we start the book actually in the chapter where we talk about power with the example of Serena Williams giving birth. I don't know how many of you followed this. One of my kids is only 6 weeks younger than Serena's kids. So I thought that we were like best buds on Instagram while we were both pregnant, even though she doesn't know me at all. So I follow her pregnancy.
Not yet.
Not yet. Right. She will. But so anyway, so most people have heard the story at this point. But the short version is that, she went into the hospital to go have her baby. She had some complications, but the medical staff didn't believe her that she was having a health issue or some sort of clotting issue. She had a history of blood clots, and she kept on telling her medical providers, like, something is wrong. I don't feel right. You need to give me this particular type of scan or blood work or whatever. And they ignored her for a really long time. But because she was Serena Williams, like international tennis star and, generally famous person, eventually, she was able to express her wishes that they perform the test, and lo and behold, they discovered that she had this complication, which she knew, for, I don't know, if like 12 hours or 24 hours before they ran the test that allowed them to diagnose it. And as a result, she was able to survive, and it really could have been very life-threatening. But the story doesn't really end there, right? So that's sort of an instance of power at the personal level, right? She was saying, like, listen to me, I am a woman, I've just given birth, I am telling you something is wrong with my body. And people didn't listen to her initially, either because there's this history of, people not listening to women about their bodies, especially in the medical profession, because she was a Black woman, but because she was also a famous Black woman, eventually that sort of outweighed the sort of other forces of power that might have otherwise not enabled her to receive that test. And anyway, she just experienced this as this personal incident. And when she did come out of the hospital, she made this really cute video. You can watch it on the internet. There's a little picture of her baby. And right at the end of the video, she says something, she sort of alludes to the fact that there were complications. She doesn't even outright say, like, this specific thing happened to me. She just said, oh, it was like a little bit complicated. There were some complications, but like, look who we got. Look at my cute baby. And I think she expected people watching the video to just focus on her cute kid because the kid is adorable. But what ended up happening is that a lot of women, mostly Black women, sort of heard that little bit, that sort of throwaway line at the end about the complications, and they started writing in the comments with all the complications and similar experiences that they had experienced in the hospital. And the comments just kept on coming and coming. And Serena, she had a newborn, so she wasn't really online all the time. But a couple of weeks later, she made a second major public post and said, hey, I heard all of your stories and I did some research and I found out that this is a problem among Black women giving birth. Mortality statistics among Black women in childbirth are super high. They're much higher than white women. They are much higher controlling for all sorts, and she cited all sorts of reports. I believe that, that show that even if you control for like education level or income status, all of the explanations that people usually say, oh, these are why the statistics are what they are. Like, even controlling for those factors, it still showed that Black women experience mortality in childbirth much more than white women. And she was like, hey, I realized that this is a structural problem. And then she began this advocacy campaign around this issue, tying into a bunch of groups, Black women's reproductive justice groups that have been working on this for a very long time. And it gave birth, so to speak, to this movement spearheaded by Serena Williams. But really what she had identified sort of through this personal experience was this larger structural issue, that it wasn't just about her, but it sort of filtered up through this entire matrix of domination and was exposed to be this large scale problem. And so these are some of the examples that we talk about in the book in order to show both how sort of power works in the world, but then also about sort of what some of the solutions are. So I don't know if Catherine, if you want to take over and talk a little bit about that part.
Yeah, and just to add about the, one of the reasons Serena's story is really interesting from a data perspective as well, is that it relates to something that we call in the book missing data, after an artistic project of the same name. And thinking about the fact that, especially when it comes to women or people of color, marginalized groups, more generally speaking, our government institutions and our corporate institutions tend to not collect data about those groups. Or actually there's like sort of two interrelated problems. One is that they don't collect data about things in a systematic way, such as maternal mortality or such as femicides, being like gender-related killings of women. And then of course on the converse, on the other side, we are overly surveilling, for example, neighborhoods of color, or overly surveilling poor people. So there's sort of these dual problems of representation, of either undercounting or overcounting. And in the case of Serena, this is one of these things where it falls into that missing data category, where you know, when you actually dig into maternal mortality figures in the US, it's only been recently that there's been some movement. I mean, you think in your head like, oh, that's a thing that somebody's collecting data about, right? Like that's an important public issue. People who are dying in childbirth or immediately thereafter, that's some kind of statistics that we're monitoring and that somebody knows, right? And then you actually look into these things, and in fact, there has not been, that people are now working on this more because of, in particular, data journalism. I think like Serena Williams, data journalism, like ProPublica's work, but that's been pointing out just exactly how terrible our actual tracking of the issue is. So we have no comprehensive federal database around maternal mortality. And this is the case with many other things that relate to the bodies of women and people of color, other marginalized groups, et cetera. So this is sort of like a pattern. And again, it's like a sort of pattern of power in terms of like, what do we deem as important in the world and what do we sort of systematically ignore and neglect and sort of not work on fixing or not even care about enough to know the scope of the problem. And so one of the strategies, particularly for this issue of missing data, so in the case where, you know, we encounter sexism in the form of missing data, like there literally is an absence of data about certain kinds of bodies that we think should be rectified. Not all of those absences should be rectified, right? But when we think this should be rectified, one strategy in terms of thinking of like, how do we address this, is thinking about how do we collect counter data. And so we see the collection of counter data in a wide variety of forms. In the book, we talk about the case of Maria Salguero, who's basically an individual person in Mexico. And this is the case where of feminicides, so gender-based killings, that are widespread, emerging really issue of public anger in Latin America. There's been a lot of organizing and marching and so on. And Mexico even has a law defining feminicide. So there actually is like a legal framework, and yet they are not collecting data to understand the full scope of the problem. And so this is sort of where Maria stepped in. She literally isn't even affiliated with a group or anything, but since 2016, she has been collecting a database of, she scans the media, any media reports of women who were killed. She scans those. If she deems it a femicide, then she logs it in her database. And so she's been doing this for 4 years. The scope and scale of the problem is so great, and she's trying to cover such a large geography, that this takes her 2 to 4 hours a day just reading story. I mean, it's kind of terrible work, right? If you think about reading stories about normally pretty violent killings. But in fact, doing this work, she's amassed the largest database of feminicides. She's testified before the Mexican Congress several times. She's worked with journalists, and she's actually even worked with families to try to locate their loved ones in her database. And so this is sort of a, like, this doesn't fix the problem, but at least in the absence of systematic data about something that is important, the counter data can step in and start to provide a kind of evidence base to gather people and to take some kind of action. So that's a kind of like one of the strategies that we discuss for thinking about how do we rectify some of these power imbalances in the collection environment. So maybe I'll stop there.
I was just gonna give another call for questions if anyone has questions for Catherine and Lauren. And I mean, if either of you want to talk more about specific things in the book or other work, feel free. But just to keep things rolling, as you were talking, I was wondering what you are, we're trying not to make these chats like about coronavirus all the time, but it seems like there's a lot of discussion about data right now, and quality data and what we should or should not be doing with it. And I'm curious if you've seen anything in the last few weeks that has, I don't know, that you see like this direct connection between your work and something that's happening either with data specifically or with just the way governments are responding to the pandemic.
I mean, we were just on the topic of health inequities. And so if you've seen the recent reporting coming out, you've seen that like Black folks in particular in the US are vastly disproportionately impacted. And so one of the things that's happening right now, Data for Black Lives, which is a activist group around that wants to, again, in that tradition of counter data, actually, like what they do is a lot of sort of counter data collection and sort of making visible through data some of these power imbalances. They just published a call for all states to start tracking their data by race and ethnicity, which states haven't all, they published a list actually, like there's like maybe 6 states that have been tracking COVID deaths by race, and then the vast majority of the states are not releasing that data. So I mean, I think that's like kind of one interesting thing that's on the horizon. It's been, and I mean, also I guess with COVID, thinking about, again, groups that are disproportionately impacted, like of course, elderly folks as well, and is one of the sort of saddest impacts of what's going on.
Yeah.
But I know Lauren's been thinking a lot too about visualization, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've been teaching this class about feminist data science this semester, and we sort of, after we went online, we had a little bit more of work to do, sort of thinking through some of these larger conceptual issues, but we sort of pivoted just to talking about coronavirus. And, you know, I think Catherine is right to point out this idea that there are these incredibly disproportionate impacts that, again, we don't really have the data in order to be able to demonstrate on large scale. And it's sort of, I mean, it's on the one hand, it's affirming to see how some of the things we wrote in the book apply so directly to this. On the other hand, it's so disheartening because it's just the same thing happening over and over and over again, right? So individuals are saying, like, this is happening to me. I am seeing this in my family and my friends and my community. You know, we are Black, we are a community of color, and every person in our neighborhood is sick. You know, we don't think this is happening elsewhere, right? But the data is not being collected so that individuals are not, oh, what's going on? You're coming into the podcast? Hi.
Hi.
You know, but the data is not being collected except in these handful of states in order to show that this is a real issue. So that's one thing. So this idea of missing data, and that if the people in power don't recognize this as a problem at the moment that the data is being collected or the money is being allocated, or even the categories of data collection are being determined, right? Like you can collect, and this is the same thing is happening with gender and coronavirus deaths too. Yeah, but go take it back to Dada, okay?
Can I do this with you?
You can, here, you hold my phone, okay? But Mama needs to keep talking. So, you know, at the point that, you know, so all of these things are happening, right, where we're getting the stats back, but there's not enough fine-grained detail about what types of people are being affected, because the people at the point that they decided to collect the data weren't thinking about those categories. So that's one thing. We talk about this in the book too, like really thinking about the categories of data collection and asking people who are impacted by that act of data collection. Okay, you want to look at pictures of babies? Okay, okay. Okay, so I'm gonna, and I guess one more thing, and then Catherine can jump in on this too, because I think I might need to distract my child, so I buy myself some more time here. But the other really interesting thing that's happening is, and you see this at the level of, okay, I will help you, is that people explaining away the racial disparities in terms of like environmental factors or income inequality, and saying, oh, it's not that, like, this isn't showing racism, or it's not showing disproportionate impacts against Black people. It's only because Black people tend to live in lower income neighborhoods, or air quality in those neighborhoods tends to be worse, or people have underlying health conditions. It's only because of these other things. And then the individuals in those communities need to say like, no, that is racism, right? Like the fact that these people are experiencing these environmental disadvantages is the result of racism. And again, to bring it back to this intersectional feminist analysis of power, all of those different ways in which you can see power differentials play out, you know, not just because someone says, you know, like, you are Black, you must live here, but because of like redlining, right? So that one level right below the explicit laws against living someplace, but certainly at the level of like making it hard to get a loan to buy your house, therefore creating income inequalities among neighborhoods, therefore lead to income inequalities in resources in those neighborhoods, therefore leading to the health outcomes, et cetera, right? Like this is racism too. This is unequal power experienced disproportionately by certain types of people versus other types of people. So that was a little bit less coherent than I was hoping. I'm going to take care of this.
No worries. That was great though. That was great.
Well, yeah, maybe, just maybe as a follow-up, you know, some of the stuff that I've been seeing from folks pushing back on some of the explanations of like saying, you know, like, hey, I am a Black person. My race is not a risk factor. Racism is a risk factor. And so like, I think one of the things we talk about in the book, I think it's the chapter on context, but where we're talking about like, when you're making a visualization, how do you properly name and situate these forces of power? We talk about the importance, which is actually really not the norm or the practice, but the importance of naming sexism and racism as these factors. We're so, particularly in like sort of journalistic standards, I think it feels very wrong to say racism is at fault here, right? I mean, people want to explain it with these other things that sound more quote unquote neutral, but I think we're actually doing a disservice by continually kind of masking those things. And we're also, at least in terms of like white people, are making ourselves as white people feel better about like, oh, it's this other thing, right? So we talk about the importance of basically just naming the forces at work that truly do explain the differentials in the data.
Yeah, that's a great point. So Sarah Rankin has a question, and Sarah, if you want to unmute yourself, you could just directly, if you're able to. Otherwise, I can just read it, or Catherine. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, I think. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey. Yeah, this is something I've run into a lot where you want to do an analysis by gender, but the gender data you have is just on a binary, and you're not sure if it's self-reported or really reflects people's like actual, you know, beliefs about their own gender. So you wind up with this kind of like conflict between doing an analysis that might surface some real dynamics that are important and sort of overriding people's self-conceptions of gender or masking a more complex, you know, construction of gender. Does this like framework help think about how to make choices there?
Yes. So yeah, I would like open the book and say chapter 4, I think it is. Yeah, so our 4th chapter is what gets counted counts, but it's all about rethinking binaries, and we start with the gender binary as like, because it's such a quintessential thing that feminist theorists have approached and said, well, you know, every time we have a binary, like I would say a general feminist strategy is to be very suspicious of binaries, because often what a binary is hiding behind it, like even if you just think about like the male-female binary, is a hierarchy. And so we know like the male-female binary is actually a hierarchy, and actually male is on top and female is on bottom. And like feminists have used that as a kind of an analytic where in a way of challenging other binaries, so things like reason and emotion, or nature and culture, and things like that. So in the book we talk about sort of the importance of very intentionally and carefully thinking through one's categories. You know, like, I mean, this will come in the data process where you're like, you know, even just kind of laying out, like designing the research basically, or designing how you're going to collect data. And in the case of gender, I mean, we kind of have a long discussion in the book about how it's not always, it's context dependent of like how, like whether you collect gender data at all, how you collect it, and then sort of how you analyze it and so on. Because of course, there's really important power dynamics to think about in relationship to trans and non-binary folks. So like it's not necessarily always the best way just to collect the data and have people making themselves visible to the system as being trans or non-binary, right? Like that could potentially harm them depending on who the data is going to, for what purposes it's going to be used. And so all of these questions are really important to think through. But then, and then the other thing I'll say that we encountered a lot, and which is frustrating, but is just there is still so much work. So like on the one hand, you have feminists in this space who are advocating for more gender disaggregated data or more sex disaggregated data, which is totally important. But still so often, so many of our research studies fall into the gender binary. And so we had a lot of things that, like, we had a lot of projects that we talked about in the book where we wanted to show them because they were good work, but then they were still very much in the gender binary, you know? And so the way that we negotiated that was we would like talk about the work, and then we would put a caption and say, this like visualization or this study did not address trans or non-binary people, and it remains in the binary, as a way of like calling it out. Because I think it's like you want to build on research that's looking at gender differences, but at the same time acknowledge that it has participated in an erasure of certain people's identities and voices by remaining in the gender binary. And so it is still doing harm at some level as well. So that was our sort of compromise answer to that. But yeah, I think, I don't know, I would love to hear what you would say about that, or any like problems that you've run into before.
Yeah, I think that's the basic conundrum, is that a lot of the time that's how the data is available. So you're sort of faced with this, like you either do the analysis that way and surface what you can surface, or you don't do the analysis at all, and then you're losing something that way as well. And then I think there's also just like a data question, which is if you have two big groups and one very small group, like the power of your analysis and like what you can actually say is you wind up kind of reverting to a binary anyway from a data analysis perspective, even if you're like trying to be as inclusive as possible about the way that you're categorizing people, just because of the disproportionate ways that people fall into those groups. So yeah, I think there's just a gap between like the ideal way. And yeah, a lot of the time you're not doing your own data collection, you're not doing your own data design, you're using data that exists already. And so you can't make the choices that might be ideal choices. And then even if you could, the analysis might not really be tractable at that level.
Right, totally. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I think one at least sort of compromise strategy is that just like pointing it out. So I think you can always point it out, at least, like even if your analysis or something remains in the binary, you can always say, like, we didn't have enough data for trans and non-binary folks, and so you know, that is an area of future research, you know, and like kind of pointing it out that it's like the data wasn't rich enough to go there, or wasn't able to go there. And then one of the strategies that I've seen advocated for in more of like trans and non-binary communities is thinking about, and also like Native Americans as well, because that, again, that's like a case where it's a very small percentage of a population, but you know, but so you're never going to like maybe necessarily have enough to make some conclusions or something, but is saying, well, actually, how do we design more work that intentionally centers those groups? So it's really much more like robust and specifically about those groups in terms of getting understanding, and not only always just representing them at the level of the population, for which, yeah, they're going to be a small percentage.
I would just add into that. I feel like this question, the response to this question, which I also totally agree with, which is like, even if you're dealing with data that hasn't been collected in the way that you might have done it, or you hope that it might, just to be explicit about the limits of your data and say, you know, or even if you do need to yourself to like aggregate the data, sort of generalize it so that you can get more statistical power, just to be explicit about that step and to say, this is what I did, or this, you know, these numbers relate to gender considered as such. Just be explicit about it. And by being explicit about it, and this is the point that I wanted to make, is that you're actually producing better data science, right? Because it is more accurate, because you're telling people this is the type of population to whom this work applies, right? And this relates to this larger point that we try to underscore again and again in the book, you know, being critical about these practices doesn't mean that you shouldn't use them, or that like everything just sort of descends into relativism. Actually, when used sort of properly and intentionally, it leads to all of us doing better work, because we can be more clear about what is actually being represented in the data. And then on the flip side, what is not being represented in the data and what we might need to focus on, as Catherine suggested, a little bit more intentionally or deliberately, or using a method that might not be quite as legible as like big data type work.
So we have a couple other questions. So Rahul had a question. So Rahul, why don't you go, and then Brett, if you want, you can go next.
Okay. Hi, Catherine.
Hey.
Hi, Lauren. John. Hi. Yeah, I'm from Lima, Peru, and I have one question. Here in Peru, we have some days about this, COVID-19 quarantine. We have some days reserved for women to go outside and buy food, and others for men. So the government went unaware about the fact that most of the homes here are run by women. So there were large gatherings of women these days compared to the only men days. So this was a death-threatening decision by the government, and is gender biased. So how do you think, how severe do you think is this problem in the US?
Yeah, well, so that's so interesting that you're from Peru. So I'm working right now with a research assistant student, and she's from Peru also. And she was exactly telling me about this, which I thought was very interesting. And so I might not completely have it right, but one of my understandings for them implementing that policy also had to do with the rise in domestic violence during the lockdown, if I'm not mistaken. And so like, that's one of the things that's kind of very interesting, like these sort of gendered follow-on effects right now actually of COVID, is that you're seeing a huge increase in domestic violence and in also child abuse, which is one of the ones that I saw this morning in the headline, that we don't necessarily, again, we don't like necessarily always consider or anticipate, because we're not thinking with that gender lens on things. So I actually think, I think the policy is actually super interesting from a standpoint of being gender aware, like really thinking about what are the effects going to be of kind of closing people inside their houses together, especially if they're in a potentially abusive situation. They can't get out because they can't like go out and walk around or whatever. And so I think it's actually a very interesting gendered response to that situation. So I mean, and I would say, like I can see like where folks might say, well, it's a gender bias, but in fact, I think it's quite gender aware, and it would be really interesting to know if it had any effect on alleviating, because I understood from my student, Angeles, that there were many calls to domestic abuse hotlines. So it'd be interesting to know whether the policy had any effect on reducing that number of calls, for example. And Lauren, I don't know if you have a...
Yeah, I was thinking about that. There has to be more days for women than for men, because we have more houses running by women. So I think this is they were unaware about that fact, you know. And I want to know if how do you feel this problem is in the US about this gender bias decisions by the government?
Yeah.
Or gender aware, gender aware.
I would actually say that, like, I actually think some of the governments in Latin America and some of the public discourse is further ahead, in my opinion, than the U.S., for example, because, like, in a sense, U.S. law, in a way, because it's like equal opportunity, like we have these protected classes of gender and race, but like we often treat everybody with this race blindness or gender blindness, which is to say, often folks in the US feel that it's wrong to consider a gender or consider race in applying some kind of policy or something like that. And so like, I would say the US is doing that same thing. Like I haven't seen any kind of consideration of gender or race or even class or anything in regards to the COVID response. Like it's not considering any of those dimensions of equity. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
So Brett, I think Brett has a question.
Yeah. First, I just want to thank you both. I'm teaching a critical statistics course to doctoral students at the City University this semester and using your work, and it's just really impressive. The thing that I always struggle with around these, critical approaches to quant is the concept of intersectionality. The additive models using interactions just feels like it just doesn't do it, just does it injustice. And so I'm just wondering how you've handled that or think about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I actually feel like, so again, this is where I feel like we need more folks exactly at the place where you're teaching, sort of like at this intersection of statistics and critical thinking or feminist approaches or social justice approaches or what have you, because I actually feel like the better methods have yet to be invented. I do think sometimes an additive model is enough. So like, I think and sometimes it's better than nothing, right? So like, if you look at, for example, Joy Bolamwini's work, where she's working on facial recognition and was showing how facial detection algorithms perform just far worse on Black women in particular than on white men. So she has a great paper with Timnit Gebru, and it's doing this, basically just this additive model. That's sort of like, it's not identifying people's race, but it's doing a kind of paleness of the skin measure, which is the standard measure in dermatology, actually. But so in that case, it's sort of intersecting that with gender and then showing what are the results when they test these different facial detection models. And so I think like in that case, that work is groundbreaking precisely because nobody was doing it. You know what I mean? Like no one was like even thinking about race in these models. And then she now has this empirical work that demonstrates like just exactly how terrible the training data sets are. But then I agree in the sense that, again, it's sort of what is the problem at hand that you're trying to analyze? And then sometimes it can feel like reduction. And so and I think, often, if you talk to some of the humanities theorists that mobilize the concept of intersectionality, or even the legal theorists, they would say it's not, we don't want to collapse anyone to just one dimension of their identity, like gender. We also don't want to collapse people to just two dimensions of their identity, like gender and race, right? So I think it's a really important thing. And my only, again, I feel like better quantitative methods could be developed. So I feel like there is a quantitative path there. It's just we need to think more clearly about what that might be and do some more kind of innovation of bringing those worlds together. And then I think the other path I would say where I think this could be interesting would be to combine the quantitative analysis with the qualitative, because that's often where the reduction critiques come in, is when you've collapsed rich experiences into just two things or something like that. It's sort of how do we augment some of those kind of group identities that are important to analyze sort of different trends by, but then augment those with some richer context, which often can come in the form of qualitative data or storytelling or interviews or on the ground or something like that. And so there's a great, this is not particularly intersectional exactly, but a great mixed methods work that I've seen recently is Mary Gray's Ghost Work book. And I loved, so for me, I get really excited when I see sort of this mixed methods where they do quantitative work and qualitative work. So she and her co-author ran a number of really large computational and quantitative studies about ghost work, which is sort of crowdsourced labor that's global. And then also did these really in-depth ethnographic studies and interviews. And then they weave them together in a really a great, just super amazing way in the book. So that's the kind of work that for me gets really exciting, because you combine the statistical side of the analysis with then deep context. But then the deep context lacks often because it's so localized, right? And so you want to show bigger trends. And so then that's where the quantitative work comes back in. So, yeah.
I just want to say hi, everyone. I'm back. I had to call in from my phone because my house's internet, my neighborhood's internet, I have cable modem, is like, it's a disaster right now. Everyone is online all the time and we get kicked off all the time.
Yeah.
If you're talking about sort of statistical things, I just wanted to say I've been teaching this class. I've been sort of working through a lot of these questions right now. And if the Jupyter notebooks that I've been using for my class are on GitHub. So if you go look for me on GitHub and then go find the class called Feminist Data Science, you can find a couple of examples of it, like what Catherine was describing. So sort of doing pretty lightweight statistical modeling, but then talking through sort of how far does this get you? What are the limits? What additional context do we need to add to this?
That's great. That's great. So I'll find that link real quick and put those up. So we have about 5 minutes left in the hour. I don't see any other questions flowing through on the chat window, but I would maybe just throw one more to sort of wrap this up a little bit. And you've talked a little bit about this, but I'm wondering from an individual researcher, analyst, data visualizer person, I don't think we've come up with the right noun for that yet. As individuals are there things that we can or should do in this area? Like what are the practical takeaways that people should think about when they go back to work after this call?
I mean, to me, the important thing to realize is that like these problems are huge and we are all individuals, right? So you do what you can from your position to change what you can, right? And that may mean that like you work at Amazon or something. So start thinking about labor conditions at Amazon. It may be that you have the luxury of choosing to start your own project or, you know, have a lot more autonomy in your decisions. So orient yourself towards issues of power that are around you and talk to people who are experiencing those things. But I don't think there's a blanket thing to do except to realize that, you know, not everyone needs to do all things, but that the takeaway is that you can change what you are close to. And so if you sort of think a little bit about who you are, who is impacted by your work, what skills you have, who you want to ally yourself with, and just make some choices.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And like one of the concepts that we discussed, you know, sort of what Lauren is saying about working on yourself is one of the most important things, because one of the things that we describe in the book is a concept called the privilege hazard. And what that means is just those of us who sit at these multiple intersections of dominant identities. So like I'm white, I'm an academic, I'm highly educated, I'm middle class. It's going to be harder for us with all like this compounding of dominant identities. Like we don't experience the world in the same way that folks who have a combination of many minoritized identities experience it. So we have to work that much harder. Like if our goals and our values are around equity and justice, then we have to work harder, you know, because the status quo for us is going to be to design and do things and build systems for people like us, right? And so we have to work hard to try to counteract that bias.
Yeah. Great. Catherine, Lauren, thanks so much for chatting with everybody. I hope everybody had a good time-ish. So I'll just quick mention for next week's talk. So Monday's Easter Monday, I guess. So we won't be doing anything on Monday. Tuesday, kids are getting back to school here, and my wife has to go back to work at the hospital, so I'm on kid duty all day trying to figure out new schedules. So Monday and Tuesday we're off. Wednesday and Thursday we're going to go a different route. We're going to have some authors on. So we're going to have Cassia St. Clair on Wednesday, who's written this book, The Golden Thread, and also this great book called The Secret Lives of Color, which is really great. And then on Thursday it'll be Jimmy Soni, who has a book on Claude Shannon, which was really interesting, and he's going to preview his new book that's coming out in a little bit on the origins of PayPal, so that'll be fun. And Friday, I think we're all set, but I can't announce it until I can get everything set to go, but at least Wednesday and Thursday. So, Lauren, Catherine, thanks a lot. It was great. Good luck with the book. I hope you get to make the digital virtual tour happen. That would be
yes.
cool. Great.
Thanks so much.
Congrats on the book. It's great. It's must have, I think. So
Yeah.
thanks everybody. Take care, stay safe and stay healthy. And
Thanks,
yeah,
John.
see you all soon. Okay. Bye everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks so much.